In the summer of 1929, this park was full of happy screams and families having a wonderful day out, as it was the Gillingham Fete. But as night fell, those screams turned to screams of anguish and pain, as a disaster of unimaginable horror took place before their eyes. This is the fireman's wedding tragedy. So first things first, we should probably talk about what the fireman's wedding actually was. It was a popular traditional event that took place every year at the Gillingham Fair in Kent. The fair lasted for a couple of days in the summer, and a large important part of it was that it raised funds for the local hospital St Bartholomew's. And every year, this fair had a spectacular climax. When the last day of the fair came around, the local fire brigade would put on something of a pantomime. And this pantomime involved a wedding ceremony, with two local firemen dressing up, one as the bride and one as the groom, with the bride and groom mingling with the crowds during the day before their wedding reception at their house, in quotes, at the end of the day. The house in question was a very simple facsimile of a house, essentially made out of a wooden frame with canvas placed over the top. And the happy couple would gather here for their wedding reception along with their wedding guests, who were mostly made up of young Naval Cadets, Sea Scouts and some other firemen. And at the end of this faux wedding reception, the fire brigade put on a demonstration of their incredible fire extinguishing skills. The house would be lit aflame and the local fire brigade would spectacularly rescue every single person inside. Now, of course, they didn't actually set this thing alight at this stage while everybody was still in it, but they had one fireman light smoke fires around the building to simulate a fire. And all the boys and firemen inside would wave their hands and cry out and really have fun taking part in this spectacular performance. At which point the fire brigade would appear and make their spectacular rescue. And once everybody was safely out, the actual fire would be lit and everybody would watch the house go up in flames, but this time for real. Now you might be listening to this and thinking, well, that doesn't sound entirely safe, filling a canvas and wood building with children and surrounding it with flammable material. And if anyone in this celebrating crowd had ever actually had such fears, then the evening of the 11th of July 1929 proved every single one of them, with fatal results. For those of you who might have heard the telltale sound of pram wheels, yes, I am pushing my infant daughter around this park while I film this. Gotta squeeze in filming at every possible opportunity. Also, I thought it'd be a bit weird to walk around a public park just filming by myself. Who says men can't multitask? Now, I'm not sure exactly where in the park the structure was set up. From some of the pictures, it looks like it was on an area of hard standing, which probably would have made sense if you were going to set fire to something. So I don't think it was here right in the middle where this huge area of grass is. It was probably somewhere around the outside, unless of course some of that has changed in the last 100 years, which I'm sure it has. So yeah, it is probably somewhat different to how it was back in 1929. What we do know is that this park at the time was full of people, hundreds of people here to enjoy this fete. There's even signs advertising this summer's fair here, so it is clear that this is still something of a community hub where events take place to this day, 100 years after this event that we're talking about. Everything was going as normal. The cadets had worked their way up into the canvas building. The various safety hooks and escape equipment had been prepped, and the crowd of people, which included family members of both the firemen and the cadets in the building, were waiting anxiously for the show to begin. There was something of a carnival atmosphere, and the firemen and boys inside were laughing and joking together, running up and down ladders and peeping through the makeshift windows in the canvas walls. The bride and groom were up on the roof, playing to the crowd and enjoying the clownish roles that they had to play on the day. Everyone was waiting for that first telltale glow of the fire beginning. And as night fell in the park, there was a shout of "Look!" as the first sign of fire was seen through one of the windows of the ground floor. And at first, nobody noticed a telltale difference between this and the many previous demonstrations. Usually they expected just a glow and some smoke, but in this case the first thing they saw through that window was actual flame. Nobody thought anything of it, and everybody was roaring with laughter and screams of joy as they thought the show was kicking into action. And as they watched, that small tongue of flame grew and grew incredibly quickly, with everybody in the crowd thinking that this was the most realistic and best demonstration they'd seen yet. And as the crowd cheered, the cries of help, help came from the inside of the building, as everybody usually expected, with everybody inside playing the parts of the victims needing rescuing from this incredible fire. And so everybody just kept cheering them on. And as the flames grew, up on the roof and at the windows they could see the children or the wedding party inside waving and crying, and everybody was absolutely loving it. At this point the entire base of the house was on fire, and the flames were continuing to rise. And it was perhaps at this point that some people in the audience were starting to wonder when the actual rescue would begin to take place. And at this point, it did. Standing around the structure were other members of the local fire brigade, who, perhaps for the first few moments of the demonstration, had been somewhat dumbstruck by something that they did not expect. And after those first few seconds, they were the only people in the crowd to realise that something had gone incredibly wrong. It's quite difficult to put yourself there at the time. Standing more or less in the middle of the park right now, trying to picture myself stood in a crowd of hundreds of people watching this tower go up as night fell. It's pretty difficult, not only because, it's a beautiful sunny day and there are lots of people here, but nowhere near as many. Standing here right now, it's so hard to picture the horror of what these people must have witnessed happening right in front of them. Sorry to interrupt the video, just a quick reminder that if you're enjoying it so far and you're finding it interesting, hit that like button, subscribe to the channel for more videos like this. Okay, back to the video. Two firefighters immediately ran and grabbed hand extinguishers and began trying to fight the flames. But by this point, the blaze was already way too strong. The various tools they had lying around were immediately put into action. Escape ladders were grabbed, and water was immediately blasted onto the structure. But by this point, the flames were already reaching the top of the building. The first person in the crowd to realise that something wasn't quite right was 6-year-old Molly Cheeseman, whose brother Eric was inside the building. She had been watching her brother inside the house, and after those first few moments, started screaming,
"Eric's burning! Eric's burning!"
But at first, her cries couldn't break through the still screaming and cheering crowd. But it was only seconds before Molly's cries and the panicked actions of the firefighters outside the building that this terrible realization started to dawn on those watching. This was no longer a fun pantomime, and they were witnessing firsthand and up close their loved ones burning to death. At once the screams of joy turned to screams of terror and pain, and despite the heroic efforts of the firemen surrounding the building, it was clear to almost everybody at this point that it was just too late. The building had gone up in flames so quickly, as it was designed to do, that those on the ground and those unfortunate people still inside could do nothing to stop what was happening. Witnesses said that they could still see people running around inside and at the windows and on the roof, still waving their arms, pleading for help. And as many in the crowd grew dumbstruck with the horror of what they were witnessing, the cries and shrieks of agony could be heard from the boys and men inside the building. In a valiant attempt to help the firefighters, somebody turned on a searchlight and pointed it at the building. But rather than help this helpless situation, it only ended up showing the horror of what was happening all the more clearly to the people gathered around it. It settled on the burning body of a boy who was slumped over the edge of the timber frame. As the firefighters realised that there was no hope of trying to reach those on the upper floors, they made valiant attempts to try and save whoever they could on the ground. But considering this is where the fire had begun in the first place, it was already too late. Despite this, a Sergeant Neach of the St. John's Ambulance Brigade bravely dove into the flames and dragged 2 of the victims out. but unfortunately they were already deceased. Another fireman, John Tabaret, also dove in to try and save some of the victims, and another fireman, Francis Bull Cockayne, did the same. Unfortunately, neither one of them was successful in the heroic attempt, and both died. The last that was seen of Cockayne was him leaping from the building with a boy under each arm, none of whom survived. And Cockayne wasn't the only one to try and leap from the burning building. Petty Officer John Nutton, who was part of the wedding reception and had been dressed as Auntie, leapt to his death, with his costume burning as he fell. Royal Mitchell, who had been playing the clown at the top of the structure, also made the jump, and the crowd, which included his wife and daughter, saw him on fire, pick himself up and dive into some water nearby. Unfortunately, his injuries were already too severe, and after spending 30 hours in hospital, he also passed away. The mother of Cadet Leonard Sills saw him raise his hands in the air and fall back into the fire, and moments later she was heard crying,
I know he's gone. I know he's gone.
So many mothers, fathers, siblings, friends stood in horror and watched their loved ones die. A Mrs. Sinden watched her 11-year-old son screaming for help until he fell back into the fire. Mrs. Lottie Brunning also watched as her 12-year-old David was burned to death. One of the children, Leonard Wynne, was badly injured in the fire, and his father, who wasn't at the park at the time, raced there to see if he could find him. I raced to the scene of the fete in my car. My little boy, his clothes burnt, still smouldering, lay on the ground. The poor little fellow could hardly see. He was terribly burned. I lifted him gently and placed him in my car, then raced along the road to the hospital. All through the night, I sat by his bedside. He was so brave. So brave. Leonard, blinded by his burns and in a huge amount of pain, requested that his father stay beside him in hospital. And despite his terrible injuries, he could still only think of his friends who had been alongside him, asking his father, Daddy, how are the other boys? Did they get away? Apparently all Leonard could think of was the well-being of the friends he had lost. Leonard died the following morning at 4:45 a.m. What's made this one all the more difficult, not just to research, but to be here and talk about, is the fact that I'm pushing my own child around this park. It really does just make it hit that much harder. I just can't imagine the horror of not just losing a child, but I don't know, seeing it happen in front of you and going from that fun and joyous occasion to helplessly watching your child, knowing that there's nothing you can do, and that by the time you realise what's happening, it's already too late. It's not much worse than that. The fire had been so fast, again, it was designed to go up quick, that all in all, it only lasted 5 minutes. And despite the heroic efforts of everybody who had been there, the fire brigade, the St. John's ambulance, the police officers, nobody survived. With the few, including Leonard and Royal, that survived the initial fire, succumbing to their wounds in the days that followed. A huge crowd, which included friends and family of the victims, had watched 15 people die, including the 9 children. As you could probably imagine, the immediate aftermath was heartbreaking. The sudden intensity of what had happened, followed by the immediate silence, broken only by the sobbing of some in the crowd. With no one left to rescue, the search for the remains of the victims who hadn't been able to make it out of the building began, which, given the intensity of the fire, was incredibly difficult, as nothing much remained beyond charred corpses, and so identification could only be made by finding fragments of clothing or personal items. Some of the charred bodies were identified only by their shape and frame. One man was identified by his false teeth. And ultimately, despite this difficulty, every person, every victim was identified. And what adds to the tragedy is some of the parents of the children who were in the building afterwards said that they'd made efforts to try and convince their kids not to take part. So there were clearly some parents there who weren't necessarily completely happy with their kids being involved and saw some of the potential for danger in it. Obviously, there was a lot of potential for danger. They were putting their kids into a building full of stuff that was supposed to set fire. It wasn't like everyone was standing there with no idea of the potential risks of what they were doing. Before he passed away, Leonard Wynne also managed to explain just what had happened from his point of view.
Suddenly the whole building seemed to turn into a blaze. There was no time to do anything. The heat was terrible. But I rushed to the end of the roof and jumped.
Just going to show that there was little time for any of the victims inside. Those deeper inside the structure wouldn't have had a chance, and the only option for those above was to jump. Another account makes clear just how badly some of these victims had been burnt. The father of Robert Dennis Usher, who was 14 and had been lost, only found out later that evening.
My daughter and I were in Folkestone all day, and we didn't know that my boy had even gone to the Fete. When we returned home, soon after 10 p.m, and did not find him in bed, we thought he was spending the night with his friend, Jack Spinks. It was nothing out of the ordinary for him to do that, and we were not alarmed till soon after midnight. Mrs. Spinks came to tell us that her boy had perished, and that no one knew anything about my boy. When I first saw the bodies, I couldn't recognise Robert. Later, I recognised him by a piece of his clothing, as he was neither a scout nor a cadet, and he'd been wearing plain clothes. He was the type of lad who would be the first in rushing into every type of adventure, was always keen on joining in with everything other lads did.
Tragically, Usher's father had also lost his wife only 3 years before. Robert Dennis Usher and his best friend, Jack Spinks, were found together in the mound of ashes at the bottom of the house. The following day, Gillingham was thrust into mourning. Shops were closed, and the King and the Queen sent a message of support. A relief fund was also started, with an initial amount of £2,500 being raised within a few days. The full list of children who had died is as follows. Cadet Leonard Searles, 10 years old. Leslie Neal, 13. Scout William Herbert Spinks, 13. Robert Dennis Usher, 14. Scout Reginald Barrett, 13. Cadet Eric Cheeseman, 12. Scout Leonard Wynne, 13. Cadet Ivor Sinden, 11. And Cadet David Stanley Brunning, 12. The men lost were Fireman F.B. Cocaine, 51, who left a widow and 10 children. Petty Officer John Nutton, 37. Mr. F.A. Worrell, 30. Fireman J.A. Tabrett, 45. Royal Mitchell, 37. And Fireman A.J. Nichols, 56. The funeral was a huge ceremony, and huge crowds of people lined the streets as the procession passed by. It seemed that almost everyone in the town knew somebody who had been touched by the deaths. The funeral was also attended by about 400 firemen from across the country. Along with the firemen were 200 sailors and 400 scouts, all there to pay respects to their fallen colleagues. Following the coffins was a company of Naval Cadets, scarcely older than the victims in the coffins they were following. Now, there was no memorial here until 2010-2011, where a Canadian woman who realised that she was related to some of the people who had been involved in this tragedy decided to look into it. And upon realising that there was no memorial here and that the graves of the victims had fallen into disrepair, started something of a campaign to get a memorial placed and for the graves to be fixed. And in 2011, she had some success, and the memorial to this tragedy was put up near one of the entrances in the park. And behind me, right here, is the 2011 memorial to the fireman's wedding tragedy. As you can see, it has a fireman leaning on one side and a child leaning on the other side, and it's simple, but I think quite touching memorial to what happened here. The inquest afterwards struggled to establish any firm facts about why this had happened. Obviously, none survived from inside the building to explain any of the facts, and Chief Officer White of the Gillingham Fire Brigade had no idea what had happened, claiming that this demonstration, the fireman's wedding, had happened so many times before with nothing even close to something like this happening. The first valuable evidence was provided by Edwin Parker Bynes, who'd supervised the building of the structure. He claimed that on the first and second floors, old dustpans containing small portions of oil had been placed for the flares that were supposed to go up and demonstrate the pretend fire. These dustpans were placed on stones for extra safety. And on the first floor was a drum containing 4 gallons of a liquid-like paraffin. On the ground floor was an old barrel with both of its ends cut off, and that had been filled with machine shavings. As part of the process, Fireman Cocaine was supposed to light the flares on the first, second, and top floors, then shout the alarm from the roof. Upon shouting the alarm, he was supposed to go back down to the front door, and not until the rescue had been completed was the real fire to be set. Then, the first signs of an actual explanation appeared in the form of Jack Lewis Richards, who was a 16-year-old dockyard employee. He, along with a party of Sea Scouts, had been in the building before the event started. He'd thought about staying inside, but upon realising that he had his best clothes on, he decided to leave. Then, apparently, he saw Fireman Cocaine standing in a corner on the ground floor, saying,
"I saw him take out a box of matches and light some rubbish in the centre of the building."
Apparently, as soon as the shavings that were in that old oil drum caught light, they started smouldering. And at that point, Cocaine went up the first ladder to the first floor, but returned almost at once. Apparently, Richards then asked Cocaine if the rubbish would not catch fire quickly, and he told him that it would only smoulder. Richards was certain that the person he had seen, if not Cocaine, had at least been a fireman. But later, when he was forced to commit to his identification of the fireman as Cocaine, he replied,
"Well, I'm not quite sure."
And so his story was decided to be unreliable. Another man, William Edgar Nutton, whose brother was playing the auntie, claimed that he'd seen flames appear on the second and third floors first, not on the ground floor. Petty Officer James Harrow thought similar, claiming,
"I saw a fireman light a flare on the first floor, then he appeared on the second floor where he lit another, and finally he lit one on the top. During the time he was lighting them, I saw a flash from the bottom, as if powder had ignited, and then I saw flames from the second floor. Nobody set fire to anything on the ground floor."
Another witness claimed to have seen a silent explosion on the ground floor, and during the inquest, a government official decided that that silent explosion must have been the combustion of the shavings. Ultimately, the jury's verdict was one of misadventure, and they claimed that the fire started because of premature lighting of the ground floor fire, but could not say who was responsible. And later, the coroner amended the verdict. Death from misadventure due to shock from burns received while taking part in a fire brigade and life-saving demonstration, due to a fire being started by a person or persons unknown. At this stage, we will never know exactly what or who started this fire. Was it Cocaine, as was claimed, who thought perhaps that they had more than enough time to rescue everybody from the structure before the main fire took hold? Or, in the process of lighting the flares above the ground floor, did some burning material fall down to the lower floor and ignite those shavings? Whatever the truth may be, the ultimate outcome was that the jury stated that no human life should be risked in similar displays in the future. Unsurprisingly, the event was never held again, both out of a mark of respect to those that had died, but also purely because of the health and safety risks that were now too clear to ignore. Well, I am back in Woodland Cemetery, where I have spent a lot of time over the past year with both the naval section of the cemetery and the children from the Gillingham Chatham bus tragedy. But today I'm here because this is where the victims of the Gillingham Fair tragedy were buried. Now, another tragic aspect to this story is that back in 2010-2011, when efforts were made to raise a memorial for this tragedy, it was also discovered that the graves here were in quite a fair amount of disrepair. Some of them basically having been completely removed because they were so broken. But efforts to restore them took place, and the graves that still existed in some capacity were cleaned up and made to look almost as good as new. But unfortunately, the ones that were completely destroyed were not replaced, and so there are still some unmarked graves here. I found them. I was working on the pictures of them in 2011 when they'd been freshly cleaned, and they're still looking better than they did, but the last 15 years they have aged again. Could probably do with another clean sometime soon. And it seems almost somewhat low-key, I would say, when you think we've got the naval section just across from me, and next to that is the section for the Naval Cadets that died in the bus tragedy that I've already covered on this channel. And they've got a large sign explaining exactly what happened next to them. But for the victims of this, there is no sign explaining why they are here. And so you really have to go up to the graves to find out any information about what happened. What's nice to see are the flowers that have been here for a while, but were clearly placed by the 5th Gillingham Scout Group. So it's nice to see that they are still being actively remembered by their modern colleagues. It's just so sad to think, seeing them here, you wouldn't think much of them. And then you read the story about what happened, and you see the pictures of these children, knowing that they are right here in front of me, these boys. And you hear the words of Leonard Wynne on his deathbed, to know that he doesn't even have a headstone here anymore. He is just one of these unmarked graves in between. And this was once a little boy who was loved and adored by his family. But hopefully we can continue to remember him and the others through sharing this story. On that note, thank you for watching. This was incredibly sad to cover, but as usual, hopefully this will help to keep this story alive for another 100 years. So, from Woodland Cemetery in Gillingham, I hope you enjoyed the video. Please like, subscribe if you want more content like this, and I'll see you in the next one.